For 15 years, Jedediah Holt had listened to the mountains whisper. But tonight, they screamed. The wind didn't just howl through the Montana peaks. It shrieked like a banshee, clawing at the log walls of his cabin with a fury he'd never known. This wasn't just weather. This was a warning. He sat by the fire, his hands still, the half-carved wolf forgotten in his lap. At 39, Jed looked like a man who'd lived 2 lifetimes and regretted both of them. Grief had carved deeper lines in his face than age ever could. He hadn't cared about his own reflection since the day he'd put his wife, Mary, and their unborn son in the cold Kansas dirt. That was another man, a man who prayed. This man only worked and watched and listened. The cabin was his fortress, a 20 by 20 box built to keep the world out, but mostly to keep the memories in. Everything had a purpose. The table for one, the rifles on the wall, the single window he'd hauled from Billings that now showed nothing but a wall of swirling white. The year was 1879, but in this place, time was just the slow turning of seasons, a quiet march toward the grave. His horse, Thunder, stamped restlessly in the lean-to. That horse was the only soul on earth Jed trusted. Thunder knew the sound of his nightmares, the heavy silence of his days, and never asked for anything more than hay and a firm hand. Jed tossed the wooden wolf into the fire. He was always carving wolves, creatures that mated for life but could survive on their own. They understood loss. They understood that to be strong was to be alone. Outside, the storm found a new voice, a high-pitched whistle that sounded almost human. He told himself it was just the wind finding a crack in the chimney. He told himself no one would be foolish enough to be out on a night like this. The stage road in the valley below would be a death trap, but the feeling wouldn't leave him, the feeling of being watched. He pulled on his heavy buffalo coat and stepped into the blizzard. The cold was a physical blow, a solid wall of ice and wind that stole his breath. He checked on Thunder, forking fresh hay, his movements automatic. These were the rituals that kept the ghosts at bay. Split wood, check traps, feed the horse. Don't think, don't remember, don't feel. As he barred the stable door, he froze. There it was again, over the roar of the wind, a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the storm. It was the crack of a rifle. Then another. Someone was out there. Someone was fighting for their life in the heart of a widowmaker storm. Every instinct, honed by 15 years of bitter solitude, screamed at him to go back inside. Bar the door. Let the mountains take what they wanted. He'd learned the hard way that caring for someone was just a ticket to watch them die. He stood there for a long moment, the snow building on his shoulders, a ghost in a world of white. He had built this life to feel nothing, to risk nothing. But the gunshots had found a crack in his armor. Another shot echoed, closer this time, followed by a scream that was swallowed by the wind. He couldn't leave them. God help him, he couldn't. He turned not toward the warmth of his cabin, but toward the screaming dark, and began to run. Dawn broke over a world buried in white. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence so deep it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. Jed pushed open his cabin door against a 3-foot drift, his eyes burning from a sleepless night. He'd searched for hours, finding nothing but the wind's cruel tricks. Now, in the blinding morning light, he knew he had to look again. He saddled Thunder, the big stallion sensing his urgency. They moved down the mountain, not as man and beast, but as one creature, a single dark shape against an ocean of snow. Jed didn't need to see the road. He knew every rock, every twisted pine, every treacherous drop-off by heart. This mountain was the only Bible he'd read in 15 years. An hour later, Thunder stopped dead, his ears pricked, nostrils flaring, and Jed saw it. Down in the valley, half buried in a drift, was the weekly stagecoach. It was on its side, looking like a child's broken toy. The 4 horses were frozen solid in their harnesses, their eyes wide with the last terror they had ever known. The scene was one of total devastation, but it wasn't the storm that had done this. Jed dismounted, his rifle in his hands, his eyes scanning the trees. He approached the wreck slowly. The driver was slumped over in his seat, a dark frozen stain on his chest, a bullet hole. This wasn't an accident. It was an ambush. The coach's strongbox was blown open, its contents scattered across the snow. Mail, packages, A child's small wooden horse? The debris of lives cut short. A passenger in city clothes lay face down near a pine tree, his back riddled with holes. This was a robbery, a massacre. Jed circled the coach, his boots crunching in the unnatural quiet. He was about to turn back, to ride to Cedar Ridge and report the slaughter when he saw it. A small patch of color half hidden beneath a snow-covered boulder, the deep blue of expensive wool. He moved closer, rifle ready. He used the barrel to push aside the snow. It was a woman. She was curled into a ball, her arms wrapped around herself for a warmth that was long gone. Her fine traveling dress was torn, her chestnut hair fanned out across the snow like a dark halo. He reached down, his fingers numb, and pressed them against her throat. He expected nothing. The skin was as cold as marble. He should leave her. This was not his fight. This was death and trouble, and he'd had enough of both to last 1,000 lifetimes. He started to pull his hand away. And then he felt it. Impossible. Faint. A tiny flutter. A pulse so weak it was more a memory than a beat. She was alive. He shouldn't do it. He should get on his horse and ride away. Pretend he'd never seen her. Never felt that fragile spark. Nothing good could come of this. But his hands were already working, digging her out of the snow, his mind screaming at him to stop. He lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, a bundle of wet clothes and frozen hope. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and for a second her face was clear. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with features so fine they seemed out of place in this brutal landscape. She was a woman from another world, a world of parlors and parasols. He wrestled her onto Thunder's saddle, mounting behind her, his arms wrapping around her to hold her steady. The contact was a shock, her cold body pressed against his chest. He urged the horse back up the mountain, a desperate race against the life fading from the woman in his arms. Why was he doing this? Why was he risking everything for a stranger? He didn't have an answer. He just knew that he couldn't leave her to the wolves, both the four-legged kind and the two-legged kind that had left her here to die. By the time he reached the cabin, the sun was high, but its warmth was a lie. He carried her inside, kicking the door shut. The fire had burned down to embers. He laid her on the buffalo rug before the hearth and forced himself to think. Wet clothes. They had to come off. His hands, which could feel dress a deer in minutes, shook as he fumbled with the tiny buttons of her dress. Beneath it were layers he hadn't seen in 15 years. Corsets, chemises, petticoats. He worked methodically, his face turned away, feeling like a trespasser. He stripped away the sodden garments until she lay only in her shift, and even that was soaked through. He wrapped her in the heavy fur blankets from his loft, then stoked the fire until it roared, a blazing beast fighting back the cold. He hung her clothes around the room to dry, turning his Spartan cabin into a bizarre laundry, the air filled with the scent of wet wool and something else. Lavender, a ghost of a scent from a world he had long since abandoned. The woman didn't move. Her breathing was a shallow whisper. He sat back on his heels and stared at what he'd done. He had brought a dying woman into his sanctuary. He had broken the one rule he had lived by for a decade and a half. Don't get involved. If she died, he would have to dig another grave. And if she lived, what then? If she lived, she would bring her world crashing into his. She would ask questions. She would have needs. She would look at him with living eyes and remind him of all the things he had lost. He should have left her in the snow. He settled into his chair, rifle across his lap, and began his vigil. The rest was up to her and whatever God she prayed to. He'd given up on prayer a long, long time ago. Hours crawled by. The sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the floor. He watched the faint rise and fall of her chest, each breath a tiny victory. Near sunset, she moaned. He leaned forward, his heart pounding. What would he say? How could he explain? Her eyes fluttered open. They were green, the color of new spring leaves after a long winter. For a moment she stared at the rough log ceiling, confused. Then her gaze found him. The confusion turned to pure, undiluted terror. She screamed. The sound was a raw, primal thing that shattered the cabin's silence. She tried to sit up, realized she was wrapped only in blankets, and screamed again, scrambling backward until she hit the far wall. Her hands clutched the furs to her throat. You're safe, Jed said, his voice a rusty croak. He raised his hands to show they were empty. There was an accident. Your coach. Don't touch me, she shrieked, her eyes wide with horror. Where am I? What have you done? Her gaze fell on her clothes hanging by the fire, and a fresh wave of panic washed over her. You were freezing, he said, trying to keep his voice calm, like he was talking to a spooked horse. Your clothes were wet. I had to. Had to? Her voice rose with hysteria. You had to undress me. She couldn't bring herself to say the word, to voice the violation she so clearly felt. She was looking at him not as a savior, but as a monster. He stood up slowly and moved to the other side of the cabin, giving her space. Your coach was attacked, robbed. Everyone else is dead. The words finally cut through her fear. Everyone? The hysteria faded, replaced by a dawning, terrible understanding. Mr. Hartley, the driver, the little boy, James? Jed just shook his head, the image of the small wooden horse in the snow flashing in his mind. The woman's face crumpled. The terror was gone, replaced by a grief so profound it was ugly. She began to sob, not the delicate tears of a lady, but the gut-wrenching, body-shaking sobs of someone whose entire world had just been burned to the ground. Jed stood there, helpless. He knew this feeling. He had lived inside this feeling for 15 years. When the storm of tears finally passed, she wiped her face with a trembling hand and looked at him. Her eyes, which had been terrified just moments before, now looked 100 years old. My name is Charlotte, she whispered. Charlotte Whitmore. She pulled the blanket tighter, a makeshift shield of dignity. And you are? Jed. He didn't offer more. What else was there to say? How soon can we get to town? She asked, her voice shaking but trying for a businesslike tone. Jed glanced at the window. The snow had started falling again, thick and heavy. Storms come back, he said flatly. Could be days. Could be a week. Her composure finally broke. A week? She breathed, the color draining from her face. Here? With you? The fear was back in her eyes, but it was different now. It wasn't just fear of him. It was the fear of being trapped, of being utterly, completely at the mercy of a stranger in the middle of a vast, indifferent wilderness. He had saved her life, and now he realized with a sinking heart, she believed she had only been delivered from one monster into the den of another. The first night was a war of silence. Charlotte sat huddled by the fire, wrapped in his blanket like a queen in exile, her eyes following his every move. He busied himself with chores that didn't need doing, checking the bar on the door, oiling a perfectly clean rifle. The air was thick with her fear and his resentment. I need my clothes, she said finally, her voice sharp. Still wet, he grunted without looking at her. This is unacceptable, she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. Surely you have something else. A shirt. Anything. He did. In the old trunk at the foot of his bed were the last remnants of Mary's life. He'd meant to burn them 100 times. He pulled out a worn flannel shirt and a pair of his own wool trousers. These'll be too big, he said, setting them near the fire. I will manage us, she said. Then she just sat there staring at him, her meaning clear. He sighed, grabbing his coat. I'll check the horse. Outside in the biting cold, he leaned against the stable wall. What had he done? This woman was a complication he couldn't afford. She was a ghost from a world he'd fled, and every second she was in his cabin was a fresh turn of the knife in an old wound. He just had to survive a few days. Then he'd take her to Cedar Ridge, and she'd be gone forever. When he returned, Charlotte was dressed. The clothes swallowed her, the sleeves rolled up, the trousers cinched tight with a piece of rope. But she sat straighter, some of her dignity restored. Thank you, she said stiffly. Why were you on that coach? The question slipped out before he could stop it. He was breaking another rule. Don't ask, don't tell. Her face became a mask. I was traveling to San Francisco to visit my aunt. He knew a lie when he heard one. Everyone who came west was running from something. He was living proof of it. He ladled some venison stew into a bowl and handed it to her. She took it hesitantly, then took a bite. A flicker of surprise crossed her face. This is actually good. You learned to make do, he said. They ate in silence. The tension had eased, but only slightly. The silence was no longer hostile, just watchful. Where do I sleep? She asked, the question hanging in the air. He nodded toward the ladder leading to the sleeping loft. Up there. I'll take the floor. That isn't fair. This is your home. Life's not fair, he said curtly. You need to rest. Floor's fine for me. She climbed the ladder awkwardly in the oversized clothes. From the darkness above, her voice drifted down. Mr. Holt, Jed, thank you for everything. He just grunted, banking the fire for the night. But sleep wouldn't come. Every sound from the loft, the rustle of the straw mattress, a soft sigh, was a reminder of the intruder. When was the last time he'd heard another person breathe in his sleep? Not since Mary. The memory hit him like a physical blow. He was still awake when he heard the first whimper. He lay perfectly still, listening. It came again, a soft, muffled sob from the loft. She was crying, trying to do it quietly so he wouldn't hear. Every instinct told him to ignore it. It wasn't his problem. But he remembered the lonely nights after Mary died, the way the silence would press in until he thought he would go mad. He remembered howling his grief into an empty pillow so no one would hear. He found himself at the bottom of the ladder. Charlotte, he whispered. The crying stopped. A long silence. What is it? Her voice was thick with tears. Are you all right? I'm fine. Go back to sleep. He should have. He should have gone back to his spot by the fire and let her be. But he didn't. You were dreaming, he said. It wasn't a question. Another long pause. I saw them, she whispered, her voice cracking. The men who attacked the coach. They had their faces covered. They were looking for something. Jed went cold. Looking for what? I don't know. They kept shouting. Where is it? They shot Mr. Hartley when he tried to stop them. They just shot him. A fresh wave of sobs shook her small frame. This changed everything. This wasn't a simple robbery. They were looking for something specific, something she might have had, or something they thought she had, which meant they might still be looking for her. He climbed the ladder. In the faint moonlight filtering through the window, he could see her huddled under the blankets, shaking. He sat on the floor of the loft, not too close, giving her space. They thought the storm would cover their tracks, he said, thinking aloud. They thought it would kill anyone who survived. They left me for dead, she whispered. They made a mistake. She looked at him then, her green eyes shimmering with tears in the darkness. The fear of him was gone, replaced by a different, larger terror. They'll come back, won't they? If they find out I survived, they'll come back for me. Let them come, Jed said, and the words came out with a cold fury he hadn't felt in 15 years. He saw the flicker of surprise in her eyes. She had expected him to be afraid, or to want to get rid of her. She hadn't expected this. This cold, hard certainty. She didn't know who he used to be. She didn't know the kind of man he was before he buried his heart in Kansas. Why? She whispered. Why would you help me? Because I buried my wife and child once, he said, the words tasting like ash. I'm not going to stand by and watch someone else's grave get dug on my mountain. He left her then, climbing back down the ladder, his mind racing. He had thought he was rescuing a victim of a tragic accident, but he was wrong. He had brought a target into his home. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was coming, and his cabin, his fortress against the world, was about to become a battlefield. The next morning, the storm had lessened, but a new tension had settled over the cabin. It was no longer about a man and a woman thrown together. It was about two survivors bracing for a fight. Show me how to use a rifle, Charlotte said. There was no preamble, no hesitation. She stood before him, his oversized clothes hanging off her, but her eyes held a fire he was beginning to recognize. You've never fired a gun? My father believed it was unladylike. I can shoot a bow and arrow. I won a blue ribbon at the county fair 3 years running. Jed almost smiled. A city woman who could shoot a bow. A rifle's different. It kicks. It's loud. It's heavy. Teach me, she insisted. So he did. He took her outside into the blinding white snow, and showed her how to hold the heavy Winchester, how to brace it against her shoulder, how to sight down the barrel. Her first shot went wide and the recoil sent her stumbling back. But she didn't complain. She set her jaw, took a deep breath, and tried again. Her second shot hit the pine tree he'd pointed at. Her third shot hit the knot in the center of the trunk. Jed stared at her, then at the rifle. "County fair, huh?" "I'm a quick study," she said, a faint blush on her cheeks. They spent the day preparing. While Charlotte practiced, Jed circled the cabin, checking for tracks. He found them. 2 sets of prints, circling his clearing, half filled with fresh snow. They had been there during the night, watching, waiting. They knew she was here. He didn't tell her. Not yet. No need to add to her fear. Instead, he fortified the cabin. He barred the window with a heavy plank. He stacked firewood inside so they wouldn't have to go out. He checked his ammunition. He had enough. For a while. That evening, a fragile truce settled between them. They worked together, moving with an unspoken understanding. She helped him prepare a meal, her movements surprisingly efficient. "Why were you really on that coach, Charlotte?" he asked quietly as they sat by the fire. She was silent for a long time, staring into the flames. "I was running away," she said finally, "from a marriage. My father arranged it. To a man named Richard Peyton. His family is powerful, very wealthy, and very ruthless." "So you just left?" "I did more than that," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Richard's company is involved in all sorts of illegal things. Land grabs, political bribery. I found his private ledger. I took it. I was taking it to a journalist in San Francisco who was investigating him." Jed stared at her. The missing piece of the puzzle slammed into place. "The ledger. That's what they were looking for on the coach." She nodded, her face pale. "It was in a false bottom in my trunk. They must have found the trunk in the wreckage. But if they opened it, they would have found the ledger gone." "Where is it?" Jed asked, his voice urgent. She reached inside the oversized shirt she was wearing and pulled out a thin, oilcloth-wrapped packet. "I kept it on me, always. I knew he couldn't be trusted." So this was it, the reason for the massacre. A simple book filled with names and numbers. A book that could destroy a powerful man. A book that would get them both killed. "He won't stop," Charlotte said, her eyes wide with a fear that was now 15 years old for Jed. "Richard will never stop looking for this. Or for me. He can't afford to let either of us survive." "Then we don't let him find us," Jed said. But even as he said the words, he knew it was a lie. They were trapped. A sitting duck in a wooden box. Peyton's men were already out there, circling like wolves. And they were just waiting for the right moment to close in. The next day passed in a state of suspended animation. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, sent them both reaching for their rifles. They took turns sleeping, one always on watch. The intimacy of their situation was stripped of all awkwardness, replaced by the raw necessity of survival. They were no longer a man and a woman. They were soldiers in a war they hadn't chosen. During his watch, while Charlotte slept fitfully in the loft, Jed found himself studying her. He saw the strength beneath the fear. He saw the courage that had made her defy a powerful man, the resilience that had kept her alive in a blizzard. He saw a spirit that reminded him, painfully, of Mary. He had spent 15 years building walls to keep this exact feeling out, the feeling of admiration, of connection, of caring, and it terrified him more than any number of gunmen. On the third day, the snow stopped. The sky cleared to a brilliant, unforgiving blue. The world outside was beautiful and deadly. "They'll come now," Charlotte said, her voice a flat statement of fact. She stood beside him at the single window, peering through a small crack. "I know." They didn't have to wait long. Just after midday, a figure appeared at the edge of the tree line. A single rider, leading a second horse. He wasn't trying to hide. He rode slowly into the clearing, his hands raised to show they were empty. "It's a trick," Charlotte whispered. "I know," Jed said again. He stepped outside, his rifle held loosely at his side. "That's far enough," he yelled. The man stopped. He was dressed in rough winter gear, his face weathered and hard. "My name's Miller," he called out. "I was hired by a Mr. Peyton. He wants to talk. He says there's been a misunderstanding." Doesn't look like a misunderstanding from here, Jed said, gesturing toward the valley. Things got out of hand, Miller said. He just wants the girl and the package she's carrying. He's willing to pay. $1,000. You let her ride out with me, and you can walk away. Forget any of this ever happened. The cabin door opened, and Charlotte stepped out, her own rifle in her hands. Tell Richard to go to hell, she called out, her voice clear and steady. Miller's eyes widened slightly in surprise, then narrowed. Don't be a fool, lady. There are 6 of us. We've got this whole mountain surrounded. You can't win. We're not trying to win, Jed said, his voice cold as the snow around them. We're just making sure none of you leave this mountain alive. A flicker of unease crossed Miller's face. He was a hired gun, not a zealot. He was here for money, not to die in a pointless siege. $1,000 is a lot of money, friend. My life is worth more, Charlotte said. Miller hesitated, then his eyes darted to something behind Jed. It was the only warning Jed got. He threw himself to the side, pulling Charlotte down with him as a shot rang out from the trees. A splinter of wood exploded from the door frame where his head had been. The truce was over. The siege had begun. Jed scrambled behind a woodpile, pushing Charlotte toward the cabin. Get inside, now! She didn't argue. She crawled back through the door as another shot kicked up snow near her feet. Miller, the supposed negotiator, had already galloped back to the safety of the trees. Jed laid down covering fire, the Winchester bucking against his shoulder. He wasn't aiming to hit anyone, just to keep their heads down while he got back to cover. He dove through the doorway, slamming the heavy oak door shut and dropping the bar into place. The cabin was plunged into semi-darkness. Charlotte was at the side window, peering through the crack. I see 2 of them, she whispered. To the east, behind that rock outcropping. Miller is to the north, Jed said, moving to the back wall. The shooter is to the west. That's 4. He said there were 6. They were surrounded, pinned down. A bullet slammed into the log wall near Charlotte's head, showering her with splinters. She didn't flinch. They're testing our defenses, Jed said, seeing where we are. They spent the next hour in a deadly waiting game. A shot would ring out, they'd duck, and then silence. They were being toyed with, their nerves frayed. We can't stay here, Charlotte said. They'll just wait us out, or set the cabin on fire. She was right. The cabin was a fortress, but it was also a trap. We wait for dark, Jed said. The cold will be our ally. They won't be expecting us to make a move. What kind of move? You trust me? He asked, looking her straight in the eyes. She met his gaze without flinching. Yes. Then when I tell you to run, you run. Don't look back. Just run. As darkness fell, the temperature plummeted. The world outside became a landscape of moonlit snow and deep black shadows. The shooting had stopped. They were waiting. Jed crept to the back of the cabin, where a small, shuttered opening was hidden behind a stack of furs. It was barely big enough for a man to squeeze through. He'd built it as an escape hatch, a last resort he never thought he'd have to use. They'll be watching the door in the front window, he whispered. They'll be cold, complacent. They think they have us. He handed her a pistol. This is for close range. Only use it if you have to. He slung a second rifle over his own back and filled his pockets with ammunition. What's the plan? She asked, her breath misting in the cold air. I'm going to draw their fire, he said. I'll head west, toward the thickest part of the woods. It will sound like one person escaping. While they're focused on me, you go out this hatch. You head north, straight up the steepest part of the mountain. It's hard climbing, but they won't expect it. There's a cave up there, hidden behind a frozen waterfall. You wait for me there. No, she said immediately. I'm not leaving you. We go together. They'll see 2 sets of tracks. They'll catch us both, he said, his voice hard. This is the only way. I'm faster alone. I know this mountain better than they do. I can lose them, but I can't do it if I'm worried about you. She stared at him, her green eyes searching his face in the dim light. You're telling me to run and save myself. I'm telling you to trust me, he repeated. Now are you ready? She gave a single, sharp nod. He took a deep breath. I'll go out the front. Give me a count of 60 after you hear the first shot. Then you go. Don't hesitate. He paused at the door. He looked back at her, a shadow in the darkness of the cabin that had become their sanctuary and their prison. There were 100 things he could have said. Instead, he just said, "See you at the waterfall." Then he lifted the bar, kicked the door open, and ran into the frozen night, his rifle blazing. The night exploded. Gunfire erupted from 3 different directions, the muzzle flashes like angry fireflies in the dark. Jed didn't run straight. He weaved using the shadows, firing back toward the flashes, making as much noise as possible. He was a ghost, a phantom drawing the attention of the wolves. A bullet ripped through the sleeve of his coat. Another kicked up a spray of ice by his face. He felt the familiar, cold thrill of battle, a feeling he thought he'd buried in Kansas. He was no longer just a hermit. He was the man he used to be, a man who knew how to fight, a man who knew how to survive. He could hear them shouting in the woods, trying to coordinate, trying to get a fix on him. He was leading them on a merry chase, deeper and deeper into the forest he knew like the back of his hand. He counted the seconds in his head, praying Charlotte had listened, praying she was on her way to the cave. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Charlotte waited. The 60 seconds after Jed burst out the door were the longest of her life. Every shot she heard felt like a blow to her own body. Her heart screamed at her to go after him, to help him. But his voice echoed in her mind. "Trust me." At 61, she forced herself to move. She scrambled through the small escape hatch, dropping into the soft snow behind the cabin. The cold was shocking, but she barely felt it. She stayed low, a shadow against the white, and began to climb. The slope was steep, the snow deep. Every step was a struggle. Her lungs burned, her legs ached. But she kept going, driven by Jed's sacrifice. The sounds of the gunfight behind her grew fainter, a distant, terrifying drumbeat. Jed led the gunmen on a circular route, doubling back on his own tracks, using every trick he knew to confuse them. He was 1 man against 6, but he had an advantage they didn't. This was his home. He knew which trees offered the best cover, which ravines were the deepest, which snowdrifts could hide a man. He picked them off one by one, not killing them, but disabling them. A shot to a leg here, a shot to a shoulder there. He was a predator in his own territory, and they were clumsy, loud intruders. He moved through the frozen forest with a deadly grace, the ghost of Wolverine Peak. By the time the moon was high in the sky, it was over. 4 of them were wounded, huddled together for warmth, their fight gone. One had fled back down the mountain, and the last one was Richard Peyton. Jed tracked him easily. Peyton was a city man. He left a trail a child could follow. He found him near the ruined stagecoach, trying desperately to saddle one of the dead horses. His mind clearly snapped from the cold and the terror. "It's over, Richard," Jed said, stepping out from behind a tree. Peyton spun around, a wild look in his eyes. He raised his pistol, his hands shaking violently. "She's a witch! She ruined me!" "You ruined yourself," Jed said, his rifle steady. "I'll kill you, then I'll find her, and I'll kill her." Peyton screamed, his voice cracking. He fired his pistol, the shot going wide. Jed didn't want to kill him. He had seen enough death. But he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that Peyton would never stop. He would hunt Charlotte to the ends of the earth. He was a cancer that had to be cut out. "For Mary," Jed whispered, and he fired. Charlotte reached the cave just before dawn, exhausted, freezing, but alive. The cave was small, hidden behind a curtain of ice where a waterfall froze solid in the winter. It was exactly as Jed had described it. She huddled in the back, the pistol clutched in her numb hands, and waited. Hours passed. The sun rose, casting a pale light through the ice. Every sound made her jump. Was it Jed, or was it one of Peyton's men? Had Jed failed? Was he lying dead in the snow somewhere? The not knowing was a special kind of torture. She had survived the ambush. She had survived the storm. She had survived the siege. But she wasn't sure she could survive this terrible, silent waiting. Just as despair began to set in, she saw a figure appear through the ice. A tall, broad-shouldered man moving with a weary strength. It was Jed. He was covered in snow, a cut on his forehead, his face grim, but he was alive. She ran to him, throwing her arms around him, and for the first time since the ordeal began, She let herself cry. He held her, his arms strong and sure around her, and just let her weep. "It's over," he said, his voice rough. "It's all over." "The others?" she asked, her voice muffled against his chest. "They won't be bothering you again," he said, and she knew from his tone that it was a final, absolute statement. They made their way back to the cabin in the bright morning light. The clearing was a mess, littered with the signs of their battle. But the cabin itself was untouched. It was still their sanctuary. Inside, the fire had died, but the small space felt warmer than any Boston mansion. It felt like home. Jed tended to the cut on his head while Charlotte made coffee. They moved in a comfortable silence, the silence of two people who had been to hell and back together. "What now?" she asked, handing him a steaming mug. "Now," he said, taking her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. "We decide what comes next." He looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers. The walls he had so carefully built around his heart had been shattered. She had seen the man he used to be, the man he still was, beneath the grief and the solitude. "You could still go to San Francisco," he said quietly. "The journalist, the ledger." "The ledger is just paper," she said, setting her mug down. She stepped closer to him, never breaking eye contact. "It's not my life. I came west to find a new life, to become someone else." "And did you?" "Yes," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "I found out I'm stronger than I ever thought. And I found this." She gestured around the small cabin, at the wooden wolves on the mantelpiece, at the snow-covered mountains visible through the window. "And I found you." He wanted to argue. He wanted to tell her all the reasons she should leave, that he was too old, too broken, that this life was hard and lonely. But he couldn't, because the thought of her leaving, of this cabin becoming silent again, was more terrifying than anything he had faced in the last 3 days. "Charlotte," he began, his voice rough with emotion. She silenced him by placing a finger on his lips. "My father sold me once, Jed. I won't be sold again, and I won't be given away. My life is my own to choose, and I choose this. I choose you." And then she kissed him. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of homecoming. It was a kiss that spoke of shared battles and silent understanding. It was a kiss that healed 15 years of wounds. When they broke apart, Jed looked at the woman before him, the city lady in his oversized clothes, the woman who had faced down murderers and survived a blizzard, the woman who had somehow, impossibly, brought his dead heart back to life. "The winters are hard," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm not afraid of the cold," she said. "It's a lonely life." "Not anymore," she whispered, taking his hand and lacing her fingers through his. He looked around the cabin, at the silent wooden wolves who had been his only family for so long. They were witnesses to his long, lonely vigil. And now, they were witnesses to its end. He had built this fortress to keep the world out, but she hadn't just breached the walls, she had made it a home. 1 year later, the Montana sun shone down on a new cabin, larger than the first, with 2 glass windows and a porch. Smoke curled from the chimney. In a newly built corral, 3 fine mares grazed peacefully. A young boy with fiery red hair rode up on a pony, waving a letter. "Mail call, Mrs. Holt." Charlotte, her belly swollen with the promise of new life, came out onto the porch and traded a cookie for the letter. It was from her sister. She read it aloud to Jed, who was leaning against the corral fence. Richard Peyton's crimes had finally caught up with him. He had lost everything and was now a fugitive in Europe. Charlotte's father's debts had been anonymously paid. "Anonymous benefactor, huh?" Charlotte said, raising an eyebrow at her husband. Jed just smiled, a real, easy smile that reached his eyes. It was a look she saw often now. That evening, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of purple and gold. A wolf howled in the distance, a lonely, wild sound. A moment later, another wolf answered from a different ridge. "They found their pack," Charlotte said softly, resting her head on Jed's shoulder. He wrapped his arm around her, his hand resting on her belly where their child kicked. "So did we," he said. They had faced down storms and assassins, ghosts of the past and fears for the future. They had fought for their life and for their love. The hermit of Wolverine Peak was no longer a hermit, and the city woman on the run had finally found her way home. They had built a life not from the ashes of what they had lost, but on the solid rock of what they had found in each other. And in the quiet of the mountains, under a blanket of a million stars, it was more than enough. It was everything. If you were moved by Jed and Charlotte's incredible story of survival and second chances, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss the other tales of impossible bravery and frontier justice we have coming your way.